Now, I discovered this thing when I was about 22 years old. At the time, I was in music school, and I really struggled memorizing my scales all over the neck. But I had to, because that was one of the requirements in order for me to get my certificate, or at least that's what I thought. See, in order to get the certificate, I had to pass the dreaded improv test. Well, the test was pretty straightforward. The students had to sit in with the band, and that band was basically made of all the grading and structures. And the job of the student was just to sit in there and improvise with the band. Now, there was a trick though. Students had no idea what the band was gonna play. It was just strict improvisation. You walk in and you jam. So all year long, I knew that that exam was coming, and my strategy was basically to memorize as many scales as I could all over the neck. And we all kind of do that. We think that in order to improvise well, we need to know as many scales, as many licks as possible on the guitar. But that's not how it works though. And the reason it doesn't work like that is that an improvisation is a conversation. It's something that is being made on the fly. It's not a scripted thing. And that's something I heard a lot in music school, but it just didn't click because no one really told me what it actually meant. I mean, clearly what I was doing was not working. I had memorized all my modes all over the fretboard, thinking that, you know, I was good to go. I could improvise now. And then not only did I find that there's a lot more than 7 modes, but also whenever I had to jam with people, I basically sucked. All right, so improvisation, I can do. Talking to people, having conversations, that I could do. Now there was a problem though, because although I knew how to have a conversation with a friend, I didn't know how that worked musically. So I got to work. So I started by making a list of the essential things that need to be present in a good conversation with a friend. First, what I say in a conversation should be a natural response to what I'm hearing. Second, involved parties should use the same language. And third, I should have an idea of what I'm going to say before saying it. These 3 things seem to be essential for a good conversation to happen. So I decided to try to apply that musically. All right, so what I say should be a natural response to what the other person is saying. That basically means that the conversation needs to flow naturally. If someone is saying something, the other person is going to respond to that something and make sense. It's going to be a natural continuation of that thing. So I made myself a little musical game to try to understand that and apply that to my instrument. The game worked like this. I would start playing a very simple short lick. Then I would sing something in response to that lick. After that, I would respond to what I sang with my guitar. And I would go back and forth like that until I had no more ideas or until I was bored of the game. La, da, da, la, la. And that really helped me understand how to develop something musically that makes sense. And it also helped me not run out of ideas. And that's because I would feed my creativity by listening to what the other person was saying. Next, in a good conversation, all parties need to speak the same language. Now that part was super essential, and I knew that, and that's really why I had spent so many hours trying to memorize all the scales, because the scales were basically the language that was being used in a conversation. So I thought that memorizing all these scales, these alphabets, would help me. It didn't, but I had to figure out that issue. So I asked myself, what does it really mean to speak the same language when it comes to music? Well, in essence, it means that all musicians need to use the same tools. And in music, those tools can be summed up in the following 3 categories: style, rhythm, and keys. Now, the style and rhythm was pretty simple. It's basically a matter of matching the musical mood that's being established. For example, you wouldn't play this way over a slow blues. It doesn't match. Now, the hard part was that third component, keys. How can I match keys without really relying on scales and positions and modes. Well, thankfully, you and I have an amazing, not so secret weapon we can use for that, our ears. Now here's how you can do it. First, you're gonna grab a backing track and start playing it. Now ideally, you don't know what the track is. If you do, that's okay. But don't look at your guitar and just play the first note that comes. Then ask yourself the question, does that note match? Am I speaking a note that is part of that language? If you're not sure, play the notes just a half step above, 1 fret higher. Okay, play both together. Okay, that's gonna give you a feel for a note that is correct and a note that is not correct. Eventually, we wanna be really quick at this. Yes, yes, no, no, no. Actually, maybe. All right, the third essential component is that I should know what I'm going to say before saying it. So basically it has to do with being able to hear what you're going to play and play what you heard. Now this one is quite interesting because although it's such an important aspect of improvisation, most guitar players avoid working on it. And the reason is that the best and the fastest way to develop that skill is to put yourself in the shoes of an absolute beginner. And that's hard to do, especially if you have a few decades of guitar under your belt. But I promise, it really works. Now this is how it's done. Throw in a backing track and start singing something over it. Da, 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 ba, ba. Simple. Then you grab your guitar. Da, da, ba, da, da. That's one way to play it. Try to find another way. La. Da, da, ba, da, 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 da. And once you have that, you do it again and again and again. You see why most players don't want to do that? It's because the ideas you're going to sing are probably very basic and you probably can play something more complex, more interesting, but it really needs to start there. And you'll be really surprised at how fast the process goes. And you'll notice after a few weeks of working through these exercises that your playing is going to start changing. It's going to go from a scaled type of playing to more of a story-driven type of thing. It's going to be closer to what you want to say without even having to look at your guitar. Now, I did that for a few months, and I'm not gonna lie, I found myself after a few months going back to my old habits, relying on memorizing scales again. And the reason I went back to my old ways is that I was applying all this stuff on very simple, common chord progressions that I was very familiar with. Now, thankfully, my roommate was a jazz guy, and he told me that whenever he worked on his improvisational skills, he would always put on a track that he was not familiar with. And typically that involved a lot of chord changes, something that was surprising to him and he had to respond. He was really put on the spot during that practice session. I wasn't doing that. I was just using typical blues backing tracks, no surprises in the chord changes, and that's how I thought I would develop my improvisational skills. So I stopped doing that and I started using my friend's backing track. And that's when it really clicked. In this video, I'll show you how you can apply everything you learned today, just like my friend showed me many years ago.